Right. Run this past me one more time? Sure. It's simple. Talking about this gets people worked up and thinking thoughts we don't want them to think. So we'll simply ban them talking about it or reading about it or writing about it, and that'll make everyone calm down and stop thinking about it, obviously.
Ha ha, you fool! You fell victim to one of the classic blunders.
But first, hello! My name is Garvin, and this is a patron-requested video where we talk about the book Arguing About Slavery, and the general setup of the United States in the decades before the Civil War. So if you end up enjoying this video, please leave a thank you to my patrons below, and if you didn't, it's likely my fault, so don't blame them. With that said, let's turn to the book Arguing About Slavery. The book itself is about the rather thunderous debate over the so-called Gag Rule that was in effect in the House of Representatives from 1836 to 1844. And what it did is it prevented anti-slavery positions from being presented to Congress. Now, to explain this a little bit, in this period of history, people would generally communicate to Congress by writing petitions, getting people to sign them, and mailing them in. And there was a section of congressional meetings set aside for representatives to stand up, read the petitions to the floor, and at which point Congress would decide whether or not to act upon them. And it was taken for granted that even if Congress would refuse to do anything, your petition would be heard. And when it came to anti-slavery petitions in 1836, Southern congressmen decided they didn't like even hearing about it, so they were going to force a gag. No one could bring the subject up in the House of Representatives anymore for almost any reason. And this turned into a really unforced blunder. Let me explain why. Okay, keep in mind, this is the early days of the abolition movement, the anti-slave movement. At this time, which is generally the 1820s to the early 1840s, abolitionists were incredibly unpopular even in the free states. They were seen as busybodies who were upsetting the Union and causing trouble. So even in northern cities, mobs would gather whenever abolitionists showed up to give public speeches or lectures to drive them out of town, often with the covert or overt support of town authorities. But the abolitionists decided to try a different tactic. They would gather and write and have people sign petitions asking Congress to ban slavery, or at least the slave trade, in Washington, D.C. At the time, slavery was legal in the District of Columbia, and they were openly selling people. And while most people believe the federal government did not have the power to compel states on domestic issues, like slavery, the District of Columbia was federal property. Even most Northerners who didn't particularly like abolitionists felt that it didn't bode well for the Republic to be selling human beings within earshot of the House of Representatives. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic here, there are writings from the time of representatives saying, hey, as I walked out the steps of the Capitol, I could literally hear a man auctioning someone off for sale, which is kind of nightmarish. So the standard procedure on these petitions was that they would be presented on the floor of the House, and then a vote would be taken, usually because someone from the South would start a motion to lay the petition on the table, or table it as we would say today. This basically kills the petition, because it takes it off the agenda. Once something is on this table, it is no longer on the meeting agenda. Keep that in mind. And to take it off of this metaphorical table takes a 2/3 vote in favor. So once something's on that table, it's staying there. Now, everyone felt this was a pretty good compromise. The people up north who didn't like slavery got to have their voices heard in Congress, and then Congress, in order to preserve the good feelings of the Southerners, would vote, no thank you, we won't talk about this. But that wasn't good enough for the Southerners, who wanted to make it clear that slavery was not to be questioned in any way. So, after several attempts, they instituted the Gag Rule in 1836, which was a ban on not only presenting anti-slavery petitions, but discussing slavery or debating it in any way on the floor of Congress. And what I find strange here is the repeated statements and apparently sincere belief on the Southern representatives that this would not only kill the debate and convince Northerners to just drop the subject, but in their own words, restore tranquility, as if by forcing Northerners not to talk about this, everyone would feel fine and just let it go. And as you can guess, this did no such thing, and from that period of 1836 to 1844, the people of the northern free states grew increasingly annoyed and angry over being told what they could or could not petition their own congressional representatives on, especially when they were told it was necessary to preserve the good feelings of the South. So they were left thinking their essential rights could be walked over at any point to keep the South feeling good about themselves, and that rankled. The biggest and most dogged opponent of the Gag Rule would turn out to be the Honorable Representative John Quincy Adams, who was also a former president, as well as the son of John Adams, the second president of the United States. Just for reference, John Quincy Adams was the sixth president. He also, John Quincy Adams here, served as Secretary of State and had a long list of other positions in the federal government. He had been ambassador to almost every major European power and had been to just about every major European city, so he was actually one of the most well-traveled and well-educated men in Congress. And despite being about 70 years old when the Gag Rule first showed up, he fought it with every inch of his being and slowed down its adoption for quite a bit. And when it was adopted, he made getting rid of it his life's mission. And the book actually goes into a fair amount of detail on John Quincy Adams' life and service, and that's pretty damn interesting in its own right. So I would tell you to read the book just for that, if nothing else. Since I'm talking about the book now, let me dive into this a little bit. I'm going to tell you up front, this book is a bit dry and is incredibly dense. There's a lot of information to keep track here and a lot of people who show up. For example, the book talks about early abolitionists like Theodore Weld. The co-author of the book, American Slavery As It Is, a catalog of stories of abuses and violent behavior that was aimed at enslaved men and women. Now, this book is mostly forgotten as a piece of American history, but it was incredibly important. This is the book that Harriet Beecher Stowe used as a reference for her much more famous work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book also talks about other representatives on the House of Congress, such as Joshua Giddings, who fought bravely on the behalf of abolitionists and with John Quincy Adams against the Gag Rule, to the point that he was actually censored by the House for doing so. People like Weld and Giddings poured their time, energy, and health into fighting one of the great early sins of the United States, and they laid the foundation for more successful abolitionists to come in the 1840s and 50s. Weld, for example, would have a very direct impact by creating a training program for future abolitionists that would generate legions of speakers and give fearless men and women the tools they needed to confront slavery, often at the risk of their lives. The book also details people I can only consider villains, and some of them are reoccurring villains, like James Henry Hammond, a forgotten American monster of a human being that I did a short video on before, and I'll link it below. He shows up in this book rallying pro-slavery forces to suppress any bare mention of dissent or criticism of slavery, and that shows the fatal flaw in why this was an unforced error. This was also discussed in the Road to Disunion videos and other works I've read, which I'll be listing below, but the unforced error was that the South, in the name of protecting their privilege of treating fellow human beings as property based on their ancestry, pushed to curtail and limit the rights of their fellow free white Americans, creating resentment and resistance to the idea of their privilege, because it increasingly seemed like your privilege to own people was more important than my constitutional rights, and that makes people excited. I hope you guys will indulge me while I expand this thought a little bit, but the average human being can live with the fact that somewhere far off, injustice and brutality are being visited on strangers, and they can shrug that off as saying, yes, it's terrible, but it's so far away and so big, what can I do about it? It's when injustice comes home that people get excited enough that they find something to do about it. And the Gag Rule, the Fugitive Slave Act, all these other things made Northerners start to realize that to the wealthy slave-owning class of Americans, the rights and freedoms of Northerners were negotiable and expendable as long as they got to keep owning slaves. The South, in its monomaniacal desire to have slavery be above any judgment or discussion, ended up dragging this issue to the center stage of American politics and created, I guess you could call it, the first culture war in American politics. And their further acts, like I mentioned earlier, the Fugitive Slave Law, rubbed Northerners' face and how little their way of life and their rights were valued below the Mason-Dixon line. The Gag Rule is important because it's the first notable domino to fall in this pattern, but as I've already said, it won't be the last. And that's why, despite its denseness and its dryness, I encourage you to go out and read this book, and I'm going to argue that books like this are always relevant, because it's not just the history, they also carry a warning. If you let one group of people be considered lesser and not worth the protection of the law, if you say this group of people do not have the same rights and freedoms as we do, in order to protect that oppression, sooner or later, your rights and your freedoms will also have to be limited, because oppression will not let itself be debated. It will not let itself be examined or criticized. It can't afford to. Because once oppression becomes part of the debate, people will start seeing how this isn't about upholding the natural order, protecting the children, or defending society. It's always about slamming a boot on someone's face for someone else's advantage. Sometimes that advantage is economic, like getting unpaid labor. Other times it's about setting up a scapegoat to focus everyone's energy on so no one questions the status quo or what their government is doing. But you get the idea here. If some of us aren't free, sooner or later, none of us, except maybe the most wealthy and powerful, will be free. But even the most wealthy and powerful might find that they don't have the freedom they thought they would, and may find themselves living in fear of windows or other normal household objects. That's the price of oppression. Even if you're not directly affected by it, sooner or later you will come to fear it. It's on that note, as heavy as it might be, that I'm going to end this week's video. I know these are kind of heavy thoughts to start the new year off with, but maybe we need to be thinking heavy thoughts no matter what time of year it is. If you're interested in knowing more about the book, there's a written book review I've made for you, and there's a link for it in the description. All that said, I hope you found this video informative or even entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or even consider subscribing, as all of that helps in my eternal battle with the Dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. I'll be back next week, and I hope you'll join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading!